In a bustling emergency room where every second can mean the difference between life and death, Dr. Marcus Hayes has spent years making the hardest decisions calmly, confidently, and without hesitation. But on one chaotic winter day, a single choice changes everything. When Marcus prioritizes a critically injured young man over another stable patient, he's simply following the strict rules of triage. Yet, for one angry family, his decision becomes something far more personal, an accusation of bias that ignites a firestorm. What begins as a routine shift spirals into a public controversy. As rumors spread, accusations take root, and social media magnifies the doubt. With his reputation on the line and pressure mounting from the hospital board, Marcus must navigate professional scrutiny, personal doubt, and the weight of being misunderstood. But amidst the noise, there are quieter voices, those of lives saved, of unexpected kindness, and of the people who truly see him for who he is. The wind howled against the windows of the small two-story house in the quiet suburbs of Chicago. It was 5:30 a.m., and Dr. Marcus Hayes sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the dark sky outside. The room was quiet, except for the faint hum of the heater fighting against the bitter winter cold. Beside him, Michelle, his wife, stirred slightly but didn't wake. She always told him to wake her before he left, but he never did. She needed her sleep. Between working part-time at a local library and looking after their teenage son Jordan, Michelle already carried too much weight. Marcus turned to look at her, her face peaceful, softened by the faint glow of the bedside lamp. The same glow touched the framed photograph of their small family sitting on his nightstand. He picked it up for a brief moment, his eyes lingering on their smiling faces. Jordan, their 15-year-old, stood between them in the photo, arms draped around his parents. The picture felt like a moment frozen in time, one Marcus returned to whenever life grew heavy. He placed it back carefully and let out a deep breath. The long day ahead loomed over him. He was scheduled for a 12-hour shift in the ER longer if the snowstorm outside caused the chaos it promised. By 6 a.m., Marcus stepped outside. The cold sliced through his heavy coat, and his boots crunched against the fresh snow covering the driveway. His old sedan sat there, half covered in ice. It was nothing fancy. Marcus had driven the same car for 8 years, but it was reliable, like him. Inside the car, he turned on the heat and gripped the steering wheel, letting the quiet hum of the engine calm him. He knew today would be brutal. The ER was always chaotic during storms, car accidents, slips and falls, frostbite cases. He had seen it all. As he drove through the snow-covered streets, Marcus thought about his job. He had been an emergency room doctor for over 15 years, and the weight of it never seemed to lift. Saving lives, making split-second decisions, and bearing the brunt of every emotion from anger to gratitude had molded him into someone both strong and weary. But the weight went deeper. For Marcus, being a black doctor often meant proving himself over and over again. Even in a city like Chicago, where diversity was part of its fabric, he had faced his share of doubt and dismissal from patients, colleagues, even superiors. He remembered one particular patient years ago, a man who refused treatment from him simply because of his skin color. Marcus had walked away with his head high, but inside he had felt something chip away. It was not the kind of wound that healed quickly. By the time Marcus arrived at the hospital, the sun had barely begun to rise, and the storm showed no signs of slowing down. The parking lot was already half full, and a line of ambulances waited outside the emergency entrance. Marcus grabbed his coffee thermos and rushed inside, bracing himself for the long haul. The ER buzzed with movement. Nurses darted from room to room, IV poles rattled against the floors, and the steady beep of monitors played like a chaotic orchestra. Patients filled every corner, some groaning in pain, others wrapped in blankets, shivering. The cold outside had found its way in, and everyone felt it. "Morning, Doc," called Nurse Emily, a tall woman with sharp eyes and a quick wit. She handed Marcus a stack of patient files as he pulled on his white coat. Looks like we're in for a long one. 12 traumas already, and it's not even 8 a.m. Marcus sighed and flipped through the charts. Car accidents? Mostly. 2 frostbite cases, and a couple of people slipping on ice. We're also getting a flu surge. No beds, of course. Of course, Marcus said with a faint smile. Let's see what we can do. He spent the next several hours moving from patient to patient, his calm presence grounding the room. Marcus had a reputation for being steady under pressure, something his colleagues deeply respected. His patients often described him as someone who made them feel safe. But safety was a fragile thing in the ER, where every second mattered. By noon, the chaos reached its peak. A young construction worker, Luis Ramirez, was rushed in on a stretcher after a car accident. He was unconscious, his breathing shallow, blood seeped through the blanket covering him. T-bone collision, shouted a paramedic as they wheeled him in. Blunt abdominal trauma. BP's dropping. Marcus snapped into focus. Get him into trauma room 3. I'll be there in 2 minutes. As Marcus moved quickly to help stabilize Luis, a commotion erupted near the front desk. A middle-aged man, his voice loud and agitated, demanded attention. My father needs a doctor right now, the man shouted. He wore an expensive winter coat and had the look of someone used to getting his way. Emily approached him calmly. Sir, please have a seat. The doctors are attending to critical patients. Marcus glanced up from Luis's chart just in time to catch the man's angry glare. It was the kind of look Marcus had seen too many times before. A nurse whispered to him, That's Douglas Kerr's son. Mr. Kerr's stable, but his son isn't happy about waiting. Marcus nodded, but turned his attention back to Luis. His instincts told him the young man's condition was dire. Inside the trauma room, Marcus worked with precision, his team moving in sync around him. Luis's blood pressure continued to drop, and Marcus called for fluids and imaging. We need to get him to surgery now. By the time Luis was prepped for the operating room, Marcus felt the weight of the decision pressing on him. He knew what the Kerr family thought, that he had ignored their father to prioritize someone else. As he stepped out of the trauma room, he saw the man, Brian Kerr, standing near the waiting area, arms crossed tightly. You're the doctor, aren't you? Brian said, his voice clipped. Yes, I am, Marcus replied calmly. My father's been waiting for over an hour, Brian said, his voice rising. While you're back there with someone else. We came here because we thought this was a competent hospital. Marcus held back the frustration rising in his chest. Mr. Kerr, I understand your concern. I assure you your father is stable. My team is following strict triage protocol. We treat the most critical patients first. Right now, another patient's life is at risk. Brian's face flushed red. What is that supposed to mean? Are you saying my father isn't important? No, sir, Marcus replied steadily. But I have to save the ones who won't make it without immediate care. It's not a choice I take lightly. Brian stared at him, his expression hard. Yeah, sure. I know what this is, he muttered. You're playing favorites. The words stung, but Marcus didn't react. He had learned long ago that reacting gave power to people who wanted to break you. Emily appeared at Marcus's side. Dr. Hayes, you're needed in room 7, she said quietly. Marcus nodded and turned away, letting Brian's words hang in the air. But as he walked down the hall, his thoughts raced. The accusation lingered, sinking into his chest like a stone. By the end of his shift, Marcus sat alone in the small break room, his head resting against the wall. He could still hear Brian Kerr's voice in his mind, accusing, doubting. He closed his eyes, trying to block it out, but it clung to him. The door creaked open, and Emily stepped inside. Hey, she said softly, you did the right thing, you know. That kid Luis, he's alive because of you. Marcus nodded faintly. Sometimes it feels like the right thing still isn't enough. Emily leaned against the counter and smiled gently. The right thing is never the easy thing, but it's why we're here. Marcus looked at her and felt a small warmth spread through his chest. It wasn't much, but it was enough to get him through the night. As he drove home through the snowstorm, Marcus thought of Luis Ramirez and the faint spark of life he had seen on the monitor. One life saved. It was a fragile victory, but it was enough. Snowflakes drifted lazily against the windshield of Marcus's car as he drove home. The city lay cloaked in white, a quiet blanket that seemed at odds with the noise still ringing in his head. The Kerr family's anger, their accusations, it gnawed at him. Playing favorites, Brian Kerr's words echoed. Marcus tightened his grip on the steering wheel, guiding the car through the slippery streets. He didn't play favorites. He played by the triage rules that ensured the most critical patients received care first. Yet no matter how many lives he saved, someone always questioned him. Someone always doubted his intentions. Pulling into the driveway, Marcus turned off the engine and sat in the silence. The house was dark, except for a faint light glowing through the kitchen window. Michelle had waited up for him again. Inside, the warmth of the house hit him, a stark contrast to the storm outside. Michelle stood at the stove, stirring a pot of soup. Her tired eyes softened when she saw him. "Long shift?" she asked, her voice gentle. Marcus nodded and shrugged out of his coat, hanging it neatly by the door. "You have no idea." "Storm's still bad," she said, ladling the soup into a bowl. "Jordan's already asleep. He was asking when you'd get home." Marcus sat at the table, rubbing his hands together to chase away the cold. The kitchen smelled of spices, and for a moment he felt grounded, anchored by the familiar. Michelle placed the steaming bowl in front of him, then sat across the table. "Anything you want to talk about?" she asked softly. Marcus hesitated. Michelle had a way of knowing when he carried too much. He looked at her, feeling the weight of the day settle on his shoulders. "We had a critical case tonight. A young guy, maybe 25, blunt trauma, internal bleeding. We saved him, but another patient's family accused me of ignoring their father. Called it favoritism," Marcus said, his voice trailing off. Michelle frowned, her brow furrowing. "Why?" He hesitated. "You know why." Michelle sat back in her chair, arms crossed. "What happened?" Marcus exhaled, long and slow. "The young guy would have died if we didn't intervene right away. Their father was stable. I tried to explain that. The son didn't want to hear it. Now they're angry. They're posting on social media, accusing me of bias." "Bias?" Michelle's voice carried an edge. Marcus stirred his soup absently, his appetite fading. "That's the word they used. Reverse discrimination." The kitchen fell quiet. Outside, the wind pressed against the window panes, rattling them softly. Michelle reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "You did what you had to do, Marcus. You saved someone's life. That's what matters." "I know," he said, though the knot in his chest refused to loosen. "But it's exhausting, Michelle, fighting to be seen as equal, even when you're just doing your job." She squeezed his hand. "And yet you keep doing it." Marcus met her gaze, grateful for her quiet strength. He finished his soup, kissed her goodnight, and headed upstairs. In the hallway, he paused outside Jordan's room. The door was cracked open, and he could see his son sprawled across the bed, one arm dangling off the side. Marcus smiled faintly and stepped inside. He adjusted the blanket over Jordan's shoulders, then stood there for a moment, watching his son breathe evenly. "I want to make this world better for you," he thought. That night, Marcus lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He could not quiet the voices, the patients, their families, the Kerrs. Their words tangled in his mind, pulling him in different directions. Am I doing enough? Is it worth it? Finally, he fell into a restless sleep, the sound of the wind outside following him into his dreams. The next morning, Marcus woke to find the world outside buried under a fresh layer of snow. The sky was a dull gray, and the air felt heavy with the promise of another difficult day. He dressed quickly, kissed Michelle goodbye, and drove back to the hospital, where the ER waited, ready to swallow him whole. The chaos hadn't let up. Overnight, the patient load had doubled, and Marcus could feel the tension simmering in the air. As he stepped into the ER, Nurse Emily greeted him with a file in hand and a wary expression. "Morning, Doc. It's worse than yesterday." "What do we have?" Marcus asked, flipping through the chart. "Flu patients taking up half the beds. 2 frostbite cases just came in. And Luis Ramirez, your guy from last night, he's stable, but barely. They're monitoring him upstairs." Marcus nodded, his thoughts briefly returning to Luis. He had made the right call. He had to believe that. Before he could respond, Marcus heard the familiar voice of Brian Kerr echoing from across the waiting room. "You've got to be kidding me. We've been waiting here for hours again." Brian stood near the front desk, arms crossed, frustration etched into every line of his face. Marcus could feel the heat of his gaze from across the room. Emily sighed. "He's been here all morning. His father's condition hasn't changed, but he's insisting to see you specifically." Marcus straightened his shoulders and handed the file back to Emily. "I'll talk to him." He crossed the room, his steps steady, his expression calm. As he approached Brian, the man turned to face him, his eyes sharp. "Dr. Hayes," Brian said, his voice thick with anger, "we've been waiting for someone to check on my father. Again." "Mr. Kerr," Marcus said evenly, "your father's condition remains stable. I understand this is frustrating, but—" "This is more than frustrating," Brian interrupted. "This is unacceptable. We've been here for 2 days now, and let me ask you something. Why was that other patient more important last night, huh? Because it sure looks like favoritism to me." Marcus clenched his jaw, though his voice remained calm. "Mr. Kerr, I follow the same guidelines for every patient. Triage requires that we prioritize those in critical condition." Brian laughed bitterly. "You mean people you prefer, right? That's what this is. I've seen the way you look at us." The words stung. The sting came not from their truth, because they weren't true, but from the place they came from, a place Marcus had encountered far too many times. "Mr. Kerr," Marcus said quietly, "I am here to save lives. Your father's condition is stable, which is good news. I hope you can see that." Brian's eyes flashed, but before he could respond, an older voice interrupted. "Brian, sit down." Douglas Kerr, pale but lucid, stood at the doorway of his treatment room, leaning on a nurse for support. "Dad, you shouldn't be walking around." "Sit down, Brian," Douglas repeated, his voice firm. Brian looked between his father and Marcus, his face twisting with frustration before he dropped into a chair. Douglas turned to Marcus and nodded faintly. "Thank you, doctor," he said. His voice was hoarse but genuine. "I appreciate what you're doing here." For the first time since the ordeal began, Marcus felt the tension in his chest ease just a little. He nodded back at Douglas, then turned and walked away, leaving Brian stewing in silence. Later that afternoon, Marcus stepped into the break room, sinking into a chair. He rubbed his temples, the exhaustion catching up with him. The door creaked open, and Emily walked in, holding a small cup of coffee. "Here," she said, setting it in front of him. "You need this more than I do." Marcus looked up at her, surprised. "You didn't have to do that." Emily shrugged with a small smile. "I know, but someone should." Marcus took the cup and felt the warmth seep through his cold fingers. It was just coffee, but it was also something more, a small, quiet kindness in a room that too often felt harsh. "Thanks, Emily," he said softly. She smiled and leaned against the counter. "You know you're doing the right thing, right? Even if they don't see it?" Marcus looked at her, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Sometimes it's hard to remember that." "Well," she said, "remember it anyway." As Marcus sipped the coffee, He thought about those words. He had done the right thing. He had saved a life. That was what mattered. And maybe he would find a way to remind himself of that, even on the hardest days. The hum of fluorescent lights filled the empty break room as Marcus sat alone, staring at the half-empty coffee cup Emily had given him. It had gone cold, but he held it anyway, needing something to occupy his hands. Outside the room, the emergency department buzzed on, a controlled storm of movement and noise. His mind, however, remained anchored to the words Brian Kerr had hurled at him earlier. Favoritism, bias. The phrases lingered, sharp and barbed, refusing to let go. Marcus knew better than to let it get to him. He'd spent years enduring the same subtle and not-so-subtle challenges to his integrity. It didn't matter how many degrees he held, or how many lives he saved, there were always people who looked for reasons to doubt him. Still, something about this time stung more deeply than usual. Maybe it was because the accusations were so public. "Doc, you got a minute?" Nurse Emily's voice pulled him back to the present. She stood in the doorway, her expression careful, as though bracing herself for something. "Yeah, what's up?" Marcus sat straighter, trying to shake off his thoughts. Emily hesitated before speaking. "You might want to check this out. It's on social media." She held out her phone, the screen glowing in her hand. Marcus hesitated. "What is it?" "Brian Kerr posted something about what happened yesterday. It's spreading." Marcus sighed and took the phone. The post was short, no more than a few sentences, but the words carried weight. "My father sat waiting for care while others got treated first. Reverse discrimination is real, and it happens even in hospitals. Shameful." Below the text were dozens of angry comments and shares. People were calling for answers, some siding with Brian, others latching onto the buzz. Marcus handed the phone back, his jaw tight. "I should have expected this." Emily frowned. "This isn't fair to you. You did everything right, Marcus." "I know," he replied softly, "but fairness has nothing to do with it." The ripple effect of Brian's post was immediate. By the afternoon, murmurs spread among the hospital staff. Some looked at Marcus with concern or sympathy. Others avoided his gaze altogether, as though unsure how to respond. Marcus didn't blame them. Social media had a way of inflating even the smallest situations, turning a simple misunderstanding into something much bigger. In the hallway, Dr. Susan Harris, the hospital's head administrator, flagged him down. "Dr. Hayes, can I speak with you in my office?" Her tone was polite but firm, the kind of voice that made it clear this wasn't a request. Marcus followed her to the office on the second floor, his pulse steady, but his thoughts racing. Susan was fair and no nonsense, but he could sense what this conversation was about. As they stepped inside, Susan closed the door and gestured for him to sit. "Marcus, I want you to know you're a valuable member of this team," she began, her hands clasped together on the desk. "But I need to address what's been circulating online." "I assume you're referring to Brian Kerr's post?" Marcus said calmly. Susan nodded. "The hospital's PR team flagged it this morning. There's a lot of attention on this right now, and it's not the kind of attention we want. Some of the comments are inflammatory." Marcus leaned forward. "I followed protocol, Susan. His father was stable. Another patient's life was in immediate danger." "I know," she said quickly, holding up a hand. "I'm not questioning your judgment, but the Kerr family isn't backing down. They've emailed the hospital board and threatened to file a formal complaint." Marcus felt a flare of frustration in his chest. "What exactly do they want?" "An apology," Susan said, choosing her words carefully. "Not an admission of wrongdoing, just something to smooth things over." Marcus stared at her, stunned. "An apology? For doing my job?" "I know how this sounds," Susan said, her voice softer now. "But we're trying to de-escalate the situation. The board is concerned about the hospital's reputation. These things can spiral out of control quickly." Marcus felt a familiar weight settle on his shoulders. And what about my reputation? If I apologize, what message does that send? That I was playing favorites? That I made the wrong call? Susan sighed and leaned back in her chair. It's not about blame, Marcus. It's about optics. Look, take some time to think about it. I'm not asking you to compromise your integrity. I know how much you care about your work, but the board will expect an answer. Marcus nodded stiffly and stood. I'll think about it. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Marcus threw himself into his work, hoping the steady rhythm of the ER would drown out everything else. He checked on Luis Ramirez in the ICU, relieved to find the young man stable and showing small signs of improvement. Luis's mother sat at his bedside, clasping his hand, tears of gratitude streaming down her face. "Dr. Hayes," she whispered when she saw Marcus. "Thank you. Thank you for saving my boy." Marcus offered a faint smile. "He's strong. We'll keep taking care of him." Moments like this reminded him why he did what he did. For all the anger, the doubt, and the accusations, there were people like Luis and his mother, people whose lives were changed because he made the right call. But as he walked back toward the ER, Marcus's phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen and saw a text from Michelle. "Have you seen the news? Call me when you can." His chest tightened. He slipped into an empty corridor and checked his phone. A local news site had picked up Brian Kerr's story, amplifying it to an even larger audience. "Chicago family accuses doctor of bias in ER treatment," read the headline. Beneath it, Marcus's name was mentioned. A chill ran through him. The situation was spiraling faster than he'd realized. That evening, Marcus sat at the kitchen table while Michelle scrolled through her phone. Across the table, Jordan picked at his dinner, uncharacteristically quiet. "People are saying awful things, Marcus," Michelle murmured, shaking her head. "This isn't fair." Marcus ran a hand over his face. "It's not about fairness. It never is." Jordan looked up suddenly, his brow furrowed. "Dad, are you going to get in trouble?" Marcus paused, caught off guard. "No, son, I didn't do anything wrong." "Then why is everyone so mad at you?" Jordan asked quietly. The question hung in the air, heavy and painful. Marcus struggled to find the right words. "Sometimes people see what they want to see, Jordan, even when it's not the truth." Jordan frowned and looked back down at his plate. "That's stupid." Michelle reached over and squeezed Marcus's hand. "It's going to be okay," she said softly. Marcus didn't answer. He wanted to believe her, but doubt lingered like a shadow. The next morning, Marcus was back at the hospital before sunrise. Snowflakes fell in slow spirals outside the ER windows as he checked Luis's chart, comforted by the steady rise and fall of the young man's chest. "Dr. Hayes?" a voice said behind him. He turned to see an older man standing by the doorway, Douglas Kerr, his face pale but alert. "Mr. Kerr," Marcus said, surprised. "You should be resting." Douglas waved him off. "I wanted to talk to you. I heard about what my son's been saying." Marcus tensed. "Mr. Kerr, I want you to know I don't agree with him," Douglas interrupted gently. "You're a good doctor. I watched you last night. You were saving someone's life." For a moment, Marcus couldn't speak. He stared at the older man, searching for words. "I thank you," he finally said, his voice quiet. Douglas smiled faintly. "Don't let Brian get to you. He's angry, but that doesn't mean he's right." As Douglas shuffled back toward his room, Marcus stood there, the knot in his chest loosening just a little. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Sometimes, amidst the noise, there were voices that mattered. The sun had barely risen over the Chicago skyline, yet Marcus was already deep into his morning rounds. The ER was quieter now, just a brief lull before the next wave of patients rolled in. He appreciated these moments of calm, where he could check in with the team and prepare for what was coming. But today, that calm felt fragile, like thin glass waiting to crack. His thoughts kept circling back to Douglas Kerr's words from the night before. "You're a good doctor. Don't let Brian get to you." They were simple, but they'd meant something. Yet as Marcus moved through the hospital hallways, the tension he felt from others made it hard to hold on to those words. He knew what it was. The social media storm hadn't faded. If anything, it had grown louder. On his way into work, he'd overheard the morning news mention a viral story of alleged ER favoritism. He turned off the car radio after that. Now, as he updated patient charts, a voice broke his focus. "Dr. Hayes?" Marcus looked up to see Dr. Susan Harris, the hospital administrator, standing in the doorway. Her expression was unreadable, her tone calm but clipped. "Do you have a minute?" He nodded and followed her to her office, feeling the pull of exhaustion settle in his shoulders. Susan's office was a sterile gray space, not unkind, but businesslike. She sat behind her desk and gestured for Marcus to take a seat across from her. "Marcus," she began, hands folded neatly on the desk, "I spoke to the board last night." Marcus kept his face neutral. "And?" "They're concerned about the backlash." She exhaled through her nose, a soft sigh that filled the quiet. "The Kerr family's accusations are gaining momentum online, and it's making the hospital look divided." "Divided?" Marcus repeated, his voice calm but firm. "Susan, I did my job. Luis Ramirez was critical. That decision saved his life." "I know that," Susan replied quickly, "and anyone in medicine knows that. But the board is worried about perception. These kinds of stories snowball. We've had emails from patients and even local media asking questions." Marcus felt frustration flare inside him. "Questions about what? Following triage rules? Saving a patient in danger?" Susan's eyes softened. "Marcus, I'm on your side here. But you have to see where they're coming from. They're trying to protect the hospital." "And what about me?" Marcus asked quietly. "Who's protecting me?" Susan didn't answer right away. Instead, she leaned back in her chair and studied him carefully. "You've built a reputation here, Marcus. Your colleagues respect you. I respect you. But right now, people are looking for someone to blame. The Kerrs are angry, and they're being very vocal about it." Marcus clenched his jaw. "What do you want me to do, Susan? Apologize for saving a life?" "No," Susan said softly. "But we need to address this publicly. A statement, maybe. Clarify the situation. Remind people that triage decisions are made without bias." "And that I'm not the villain they're painting me to be?" Marcus added bitterly. Susan sighed. "It's not fair. I know that. But sometimes the truth gets drowned out by noise." Marcus stared at her for a moment before nodding stiffly. "I'll think about it." The day dragged on, every second feeling heavier than the last. Marcus stayed focused on his patients' flu cases, broken bones, a heart attack, but the lingering looks and whispers from staff members followed him wherever he went. It wasn't overt, but it was enough to make him feel like an island. At lunch, he sat in the break room with Nurse Emily and a few other colleagues. Emily, loyal as ever, pulled up a chair beside him and set a sandwich down with a thud. "You look like you haven't eaten since yesterday," she said pointedly. Marcus managed a faint smile. "You're starting to sound like my wife." "I'll take that as a compliment." Emily unwrapped her sandwich, then lowered her voice. "I heard about your meeting with Susan. You okay?" Marcus sighed. "It's not about being okay. It's about the fact that this kind of thing always happens. One family gets upset, and suddenly my motives are in question. I've been a doctor for 15 years, Emily. I've made hundreds of these decisions. But one accusation, and it's like none of that matters." Emily nodded slowly. "You're right. It's not fair. But you can't let them make you doubt yourself." "I'm not," Marcus said, though even as he spoke, he wasn't sure if it was entirely true. One of the other nurses, Jake, looked up from his phone. "Doc, you know they're talking about you on the news again, right? I saw it earlier." Marcus's stomach sank. What are they saying? Jake shifted uncomfortably, just repeating what the Kerrs said, that it was favoritism. Some radio show picked it up this morning and spun it into something bigger. Marcus forced himself to stay calm. He knew this would happen. Stories like this one that poked at deep-rooted tensions had a way of catching fire. People jumped to conclusions without understanding the facts. "Thanks for letting me know," he said quietly, standing up. As he left the break room, Marcus felt the burn of frustration rise in his chest. How could one family's anger overshadow the work he did every day, saving lives, fighting for patients? It was supposed to mean something. That evening, Marcus sat in his office, his head resting against his hands. The day had drained him completely. His phone buzzed on the desk, and he glanced at the screen. Michelle. He picked up. "Hey." "Hey," Michelle said, her voice soft. "You still at the hospital?" "Yeah, just finishing up," he replied. He hesitated, then added, "It's getting worse, Michelle. People are running with this story. It's not just the Kerrs anymore. I'm getting looks from staff, patients." He trailed off, swallowing the bitterness in his throat. "I don't know how much more of this I can take." There was a pause. Then Michelle spoke gently. "You're stronger than this, Marcus. I know it's hard, but you can't let them win. You did the right thing." "I don't know if that's enough," he admitted. "Marcus, listen to me. We know who you are. Your patients know who you are. That's what matters. This storm will pass." He closed his eyes and leaned back in his chair. He wanted to believe her, but it was hard. When the world kept challenging you, it chipped away at your foundation, and Marcus felt dangerously close to crumbling. Before leaving for the night, Marcus decided to check on Luis Ramirez one last time. The ICU was quiet, the kind of calm that always felt fragile. He stepped into the room and found Luis's mother sitting beside the bed, her hands clasped in her lap. "Dr. Hayes," she said softly, her face lighting up when she saw him. "How's he doing?" Marcus asked, his voice gentle. "He's getting better," she replied, tears glistening in her eyes. "The nurses told me his numbers are improving. You saved his life." Marcus offered a faint smile. "He's strong." That helped. Luis's mother stood and took a step toward him. "I don't know how to thank you. My son is alive because of you. You gave us hope." Marcus felt something shift in his chest, a release, like a knot loosening. He looked at her, humbled by the sincerity in her eyes. "You don't have to thank me," he said quietly. "I'm just glad he's okay." She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, neatly wrapped box. "Please, it's not much, but I want you to have this." Marcus hesitated. "You don't need to." "Please," she said firmly, pressing the box into his hands. "It's for you." He accepted it, his throat tightening. As he left the ICU and walked toward the exit, he unwrapped the gift carefully. Inside was a small, handmade keychain, a tiny leather tag with the word "Gracias" carved into it. Marcus held it in his palm, the warmth of the gesture spreading through him. For all the noise, for all the accusations, this was what mattered. A young man who got to live another day. A mother who still had her son. As he stepped out into the cold night air, Marcus felt something like resolve settle in his chest. He would keep going. He would keep fighting for his patients, for himself, no matter how loud the world got. The small keychain sat on Marcus's desk the next morning, catching the light as the sun slowly rose beyond the hospital windows. He ran his thumb over the carved word "Gracias" and let its weight anchor him for a moment. It wasn't heavy physically, but it carried the kind of significance that words could not convey. The gift was simple, yet profound, a token of gratitude that reminded him why he chose this life in the first place. His phone buzzed, breaking the moment. Michelle's message lit up the screen. "Thinking of you. You've got this." He smiled faintly, pocketed the phone, and slid the keychain into his coat pocket. The act felt symbolic, as though he was carrying something to balance the weight of everything else. The ER was already awake when Marcus stepped through the double doors. Nurse Emily was at the front desk, checking charts, her expression as sharp as ever. "Morning, Doc," she said without looking up. "Morning, Emily," Marcus replied, scanning the whiteboard where patient updates were scrawled in a frantic mix of handwriting. "You're trending again," she said suddenly, raising her eyebrows as she glanced at him. Marcus froze mid-sip of his coffee. "Trending?" "Not in a good way," Emily clarified. "That Kerr family isn't letting up. People are still commenting, sharing. You know how it is, everyone's an expert on the internet." Marcus set his coffee down, the familiar tightness returning to his chest. He didn't want to ask, but he needed to know. "What are they saying?" Emily hesitated, then sighed. "Same stuff. Bias, favoritism. There's even a hashtag now, something like ER Justice." Marcus shook his head, laughing bitterly. "Justice for what? Following protocol?" "Social media doesn't care about details," Emily said softly. "People love a villain." Marcus exhaled, fighting to push the anger aside. "Let's just focus on the patients. That's what matters." Emily gave him a nod of approval. "Spoken like a true hero." He shot her a look, but her teasing smile made him shake his head. "You're impossible." By mid-morning, the ER was running at full tilt again. A woman in her 60s had fallen on the ice and fractured her hip. A child with a deep cough cried softly in his mother's arms as they waited for a room. A teenage boy with a dislocated shoulder sat grimacing while his father tried to distract him with jokes. Amid the blur of activity, Marcus moved between patients, his focus unwavering. He assessed symptoms, ordered tests, and gave instructions with the calm steadiness his team had come to rely on. In these moments, everything outside the ER faded into the background. Until it didn't. During a brief pause between cases, Marcus caught a whispered conversation between two nurses down the hall. He wasn't meant to hear it, but the words drifted his way anyway. "Do you think it's true?" "What? About Dr. Hayes? No way. He's one of the best." "Maybe, but you saw what the family said. People don't make stuff like that up for no reason." Marcus turned away quickly, pretending he hadn't heard. The words shouldn't have gotten to him. They were nothing compared to what was being said online, but they struck deeper because they came from his own team. Doubt had a way of spreading like a disease. Even when it was unfounded, it lingered. Hours later, Marcus found himself in the ICU, checking on Luis Ramirez again. The young man was still unconscious but stable, and his mother hadn't left his bedside. She looked up when Marcus entered, her tired eyes softening. "Dr. Hayes," she said warmly. "How's he doing?" Marcus asked, stepping to the bedside and scanning the monitors. "The nurses say he's improving," she replied, clasping her hands tightly in her lap. "They said you're the reason he made it through the night." Marcus looked at Luis's face, young, peaceful, as though he were simply sleeping. "It was a team effort," he said softly. "No," she replied, her voice trembling. "It was you. You made the choice to save him, and I will never forget that." Her words hit Marcus in a way he didn't expect. In a world full of voices shouting at him, questioning him, doubting him, her quiet gratitude broke through. Luis's mother suddenly reached into her bag and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. She held it out to him. "I know it's silly, but my daughter wanted to give you this." Marcus unfolded the paper and saw a child's drawing. It was colorful and bright, with a stick-figure doctor standing next to a smiling boy in a hospital bed. Above them, in shaky handwriting, were the words, "Thank you, Dr. Hayes." He stared at it for a long moment, his chest tight. "Please tell your daughter I said thank you," Marcus said softly, his voice almost catching. "I will," Luis's mother replied, smiling faintly. "You're a good man, Dr. Hayes. Don't let anyone make you doubt that." The words stayed with Marcus as he returned to the ER, the drawing carefully folded and tucked into his coat pocket. For all the noise, for all the accusations, there were still moments like this, small, unexpected acts of kindness that reminded him why he did this work. But the reprieve didn't last. At the end of his shift, Marcus was called into Susan Harris's office again. This time, the air between them felt heavier. "Marcus," Susan began, her voice careful, "we've received more calls from the media. The Kerrs are now threatening legal action." Marcus stiffened. "Legal action? For what? Neglect? Discrimination? They're throwing every word they can at this," she said, shaking her head. "The board is worried about the hospital's reputation. They're demanding we conduct an internal review of the incident." Marcus felt like the floor had shifted beneath him. "A review? It's standard," Susan replied quickly. "It doesn't mean you did anything wrong, but we have to show we're taking this seriously." Marcus stood, his voice steady but hard. "I did my job, Susan. If you review that decision, it'll show I followed protocol to the letter." "I know that," she said softly. "But Marcus, this is about public perception now. I need you to prepare yourself." That night, Marcus sat in his car in the driveway, unable to bring himself to go inside just yet. The weight of the day pressed down on him, heavier than ever. He pulled out the drawing Luisa's little sister had given him. He smoothed it out against the steering wheel and stared at it. The words, "Thank you, Dr. Hayes," staring back at him. Tears burned in the corners of his eyes, but he blinked them back. He thought of Luis, stable and alive. He thought of his mother's gratitude. He thought of the small keychain still in his coat pocket, simple but meaningful. Those were the moments that mattered. As Marcus finally stepped out of the car and into the cold, he let the night air clear his head. Tomorrow would come with its challenges, just like today. But tonight, as he walked through the front door to his waiting family, he held on to the small glimmers of kindness, the ones that reminded him that the noise would fade, but the lives he saved would remain. The morning sun filtered weakly through the thin gray clouds as Marcus sat at the kitchen table, sipping a lukewarm cup of coffee. Michelle leaned against the counter, her face shadowed with worry. The house felt quiet, despite Jordan clattering upstairs, searching for his school bag. Marcus's thoughts were elsewhere, already back at the hospital, already bracing for another day under scrutiny. "Marcus," Michelle said gently, breaking the silence, "maybe you should talk to someone about this. A lawyer, or at least the hospital's PR team." "I don't need a lawyer, Michelle," Marcus replied, his voice calm but tired. "I didn't do anything wrong." "I know you didn't," she said quickly, crossing the room to sit across from him. "But that doesn't mean people will see it that way. They've already made up their minds." Marcus set his mug down and looked at her, the weight of everything settling heavily on his shoulders. "What am I supposed to do? Apologize for saving that kid's life? Make the Kerrs feel better so they can stop dragging my name through the mud?" Michelle reached for his hand and squeezed it. "No, you don't apologize for doing the right thing, but you can't keep carrying this on your own." Before Marcus could respond, Jordan appeared in the doorway, backpack slung over one shoulder. "Hey, Dad, can you drop me off today?" Marcus blinked, surprised. "Sure, yeah, let me grab my coat." On the way to school, Jordan stared out the window, fidgeting with the zipper on his jacket. Marcus glanced at him briefly. "Everything okay?" Jordan shrugged. "People at school are talking about you, about the stuff online." Marcus tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "What are they saying?" "Just dumb stuff," Jordan muttered. "That you're in trouble, that you're being unfair." He paused, his voice quieter. "It's not true, right?" Marcus glanced at him, the question like a small stab to the chest. "Of course it's not true. I made a choice to save someone who needed me most. That's what doctors do." Jordan nodded slowly but didn't look convinced. "It's just hard, you know? Everyone keeps asking me about it, like I'm supposed to explain it. Marcus's heart sank. I'm sorry, Jordan. I didn't mean for any of this to affect you. Jordan finally turned to look at him. It's not your fault, Dad. I just want people to stop saying stuff about you. Marcus reached over and ruffled Jordan's hair gently. People say a lot of things, son. But the truth is, the only thing that matters. Remember that, okay? Jordan nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Okay. As Marcus watched him walk toward the school entrance, shoulders hunched against the cold, he realized how deeply the firestorm surrounding him had spread, not just to his colleagues, but to his family too. When Marcus arrived at the hospital, the tension in the air felt heavier than usual. People avoided eye contact as he walked through the halls, their whispers trailing after him like faint echoes. He kept his head high, his expression calm, but inside, he felt the cracks beginning to form. At the nurse's station, Emily handed him a chart without her usual teasing remark. Instead, she lowered her voice. You should know they're talking about you on the news again. They interviewed Brian Kerr this morning. Marcus stiffened. What did he say? The same accusations. That you ignored his father. That you prioritized someone else for reasons unrelated to medicine. She hesitated before continuing. He said he's considering legal action. Marcus set the chart down, his jaw tight. And the hospital? Emily's expression turned apologetic. Dr. Harris has been fielding calls from the board all morning. It's getting ugly. Before Marcus could respond, the phone on the desk rang. Emily picked it up, nodded a few times, and then turned to Marcus. Susan wants to see you in her office. Susan Harris's office felt colder than usual when Marcus stepped inside. The blinds were drawn against the weak winter sun, and the faint hum of a space heater filled the silence. Susan sat behind her desk, looking worn and frazzled. Marcus, sit down, she said, gesturing to the chair across from her. He did, trying to read her expression. Is this about the news story? Susan nodded, rubbing her temples. Brian Kerr is doubling down on his accusations. He gave interviews to 2 local stations. People are calling the hospital demanding answers. And now, the board wants to take formal action. Formal action? Marcus's voice was steady, but his heart sank. They want you placed on administrative leave while we conduct the review, Susan said carefully. It's temporary, Marcus. Just until we can get this under control. Marcus stared at her, the words hitting him like a physical blow. Administrative leave? You're sidelining me? It's not a punishment, Susan said quickly. It's to show that we're handling this fairly and transparently. I did my job, Marcus replied, his voice rising slightly. I followed protocol to save a critically ill patient, and now I'm being pulled off the floor because one family didn't like my decision. Susan sighed, her expression pained. I know this isn't fair, Marcus, but the board sees it as necessary. I fought for you, I really did, but the pressure is too high. Marcus stood abruptly, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Do they think this will make the problem go away? That throwing me under the bus will somehow fix this? Susan didn't answer. Instead, she looked at him with something close to regret. I'm sorry, Marcus. You'll be officially notified by the end of the day. He turned and walked out without another word. The rest of the day felt surreal. Marcus moved through the ER as though in a fog, attending to his patients as best he could, though his mind buzzed with anger and disbelief. By evening, the hospital's HR representative handed him a formal letter confirming his administrative leave. When Marcus walked out of the hospital that night, the wind was bitter and sharp, cutting through his coat. Snow swirled around him, and for the first time in years, he felt small, like the world was closing in on him, piece by piece. At home, Michelle was waiting for him. The look on his face must have said it all, because she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him without asking any questions. They're putting me on leave, Marcus said quietly, his voice flat. Michelle pulled back slightly, looking up at him with disbelief. On leave? For what? To conduct a review, Marcus said bitterly. It's not about what's right. It's about what looks good. Michelle's hands tightened on his arms. Marcus, this isn't the end. They'll see the truth. Marcus shook his head. Will they? Or will they just see the version of me that Brian Kerr painted? Jordan appeared in the doorway, his face creased with worry. Dad? Are you okay? Marcus turned to him, forcing a small smile. I'm okay, buddy. You don't look okay, Jordan said softly. Michelle placed a hand on Marcus's back. Why don't you sit down? I'll make us some tea. As Marcus sank onto the couch, he thought of the small, folded drawing still in his coat pocket, the one Luisa's little sister had given him. He pulled it out and unfolded it carefully, staring at the shaky words. Thank you, Dr. Hayes. He let out a long breath, his chest aching. For all the noise, for all the people questioning his judgment, there was still this, a quiet moment of gratitude that reminded him why he had chosen this path. I'll fight this, Marcus murmured, almost to himself. I'm not going to let them take this away from me. Jordan sat down next to him. You're the best doctor, Dad. You'll fix it. Marcus looked at his son, his heart swelling with a mix of pride and sadness. Thanks, kiddo. I'll do my best. The firestorm wasn't over, but for the first time in days, Marcus felt a flicker of resolve, a small light in the dark. He wasn't finished yet. The morning sun was nowhere to be seen, as gray clouds hovered low over the city. It matched the mood in Marcus's house. He sat at the dining table, coffee untouched, staring at the thin letter from the hospital, confirming his administrative leave. Just 2 days ago, he had been leading a team in the ER, saving lives. Now he felt like a ghost, sidelined, judged, and powerless. Michelle placed a hand on his shoulder as she walked past with her own mug. You're stewing. I'm thinking, Marcus replied quietly, his gaze still fixed on the letter. You're stewing and thinking. She sat across from him, her voice steady but warm. It's going to be okay, Marcus. They'll see you did nothing wrong. Will they? Marcus looked up, his face lined with exhaustion. Or will they see what Brian Kerr wants them to see? The social media posts, the interviews, the hashtags, it's all out of control, Michelle. It doesn't even matter what's true anymore. Michelle tilted her head, her expression softening. Do you believe you made the right decision? He didn't even hesitate. Yes. Then hold on to that, she said firmly. You did your job, Marcus, not because it was easy, but because it was right. Before Marcus could respond, Jordan came barreling down the stairs with his backpack slung over his shoulder. I'll be late for school, Mom, he called as he slipped on his sneakers. Marcus stood up and grabbed his coat. I'll take him. The drive to school was quiet, the hum of the car engine filling the silence. Jordan sat with his hands in his lap, eyes staring out the window. After a while, Marcus glanced at him. You okay? Marcus asked. Jordan shrugged. Yeah, it's just, people at school keep asking questions about you. It's annoying. Marcus's grip tightened on the steering wheel. What kinds of questions? Like, did your dad really get suspended? Or, why didn't your dad treat that guy first? It's dumb stuff, Dad. They don't know anything. Marcus swallowed, a mix of anger and sadness rising in his chest. I'm sorry you're dealing with this, Jordan. Jordan turned toward him, his expression suddenly serious. I told them they were wrong. I told them you're the best doctor ever, and you'd never hurt anyone. For a moment, Marcus couldn't speak. He looked at his son, a lump forming in his throat. Thank you, he said softly. That means a lot. Jordan smiled faintly as the car pulled up to the school entrance. It's the truth, he said simply, before hopping out. He turned back and waved. See you later, Dad. As Marcus watched him disappear into the crowd of kids, something shifted inside him. Jordan's words stayed with him. It's the truth. Back at home, Marcus sat in his small office. The room was modest, just a desk, a chair, and a bookshelf filled with medical textbooks and old journals. He stared at his computer screen, his cursor blinking over the blank document he'd opened an hour ago. He wasn't sure what he was about to write, but he knew he couldn't stay silent anymore. "Dear Hospital Board," he typed slowly. The letter began as a quiet defense, just the facts of the incident, laid out with precision and clarity. But as he continued, something inside him cracked open, and the words poured out. He wrote about the chaos of the ER, about triage protocols that prioritize saving lives above all else. He explained the split-second decisions doctors make, the weight of every choice they carry. And then, carefully, he wrote about the accusations. "Bias has no place in medicine, and it has no place in my work. I took an oath to save lives, and that is what I did, not for recognition, not for favor, but because it was the right thing to do. Triage is not about comfort, it's about necessity. The young man I treated that night would have died without immediate intervention. I do not regret my decision, because he is alive today." As he finished, Marcus leaned back in his chair, the weight in his chest easing ever so slightly. This wasn't about defending himself anymore, it was about standing up for what was right. He saved the document and forwarded it to Susan Harris, attaching his patient logs and notes for the review. He added a simple message: "I will let my work speak for itself." The next morning, Marcus woke to a text from Emily. "You need to see this. Check the news." He grabbed his phone and hesitated, dreading what he might find. But as he scrolled through the local news site, his heart stopped. The headline read, "Young ER patient credits Dr. Hayes for saving his life." The article featured Luis Ramirez, now awake and recovering. A photo of him sitting up in his hospital bed, smiling weakly, filled the screen. Beside him stood his mother and younger sister. Luis' words were bold in the article. "Dr. Hayes saved me. I don't know what would have happened if he hadn't treated me when he did. I'm alive because of him." The journalist had spoken with Luis's mother as well, who praised Marcus's care and dedication. The small handmade keychain, the one that said "Gracias," was mentioned as a token of their gratitude. Marcus stared at the screen, rereading Luis's words. A strange mix of relief and emotion welled up in his chest. Someone had finally spoken up, someone who saw the truth. A second text buzzed in from Emily. "The staff saw this too. People are talking about it. The good kind of talking." Marcus let out a shaky breath and closed his eyes for a moment, holding on to that small victory. At the hospital later that afternoon, Susan Harris called Marcus. Her voice sounded lighter than before. "Marcus," she began, "I just finished speaking with the board." He braced himself. "And?" "They've decided to conclude the review," Susan said. "The article about Luis helped clear up a lot of the noise. They're reinstating you as of tomorrow." Marcus blinked, the words taking a moment to sink in. "Tomorrow?" "Yes," Susan replied. "The board agrees that you followed protocol, and between Luis's family and the overwhelming support from the staff, they're ready to move forward." Marcus felt a small weight lift from his chest, though he kept his tone calm. "Thank you, Susan." She hesitated before continuing, her voice quieter. "Marcus, I'm sorry it got this far. You didn't deserve any of this." "Thank you," he said again, softer this time. After he hung up, Marcus sat back in his chair and stared out the window. The sun was starting to break through the clouds for the first time in days, and the snow outside glistened. It wasn't over, not entirely. People like Brian Kerr would always exist, always find something to question. But for every Brian Kerr, there was a Luis Ramirez. For every doubt, there was a small act of gratitude, a drawing, a keychain, a whispered thank you. That evening, Marcus sat at the dining table as Michelle and Jordan listened to the news report about Luis. Jordan grinned, nudging his father with his elbow. "See, I told you you'd fix it." Marcus laughed softly. "You were right, kiddo." Michelle placed her hand over Marcus's and gave him a proud smile. "The truth always comes through in the end." Marcus nodded, feeling the warmth of his family surrounding him. For the first time in weeks, the weight on his shoulders felt manageable, something he could carry. Tomorrow, he would return to the ER. There would be patients waiting, lives to save, decisions to make. And Marcus would face it all, as he always did, steady, unwavering, and ready to do what was right. The sun was already climbing the sky when Marcus stepped back into the hospital the next morning. The glass doors slid open, and the familiar buzz of the emergency room greeted him. For the first time in what felt like weeks, Marcus wasn't weighed down by the storms swirling around him. The firestorm had not vanished completely, no storm did overnight, but its intensity had dimmed. Nurse Emily was the first to spot him as he approached the front desk. Her face broke into a wide grin, and she greeted him with a sarcastic, "Look what the snowstorm dragged back in. You're late." Marcus chuckled softly, a genuine sound that felt unfamiliar after days of tension. "Don't get used to it." Emily leaned forward, lowering her voice so only he could hear. "It's good to see you back, Doc. The place hasn't been the same without you." "Thanks, Emily," Marcus replied sincerely. As he turned to grab a chart, something unexpected happened. One of the younger nurses, Jake, nodded at him with a smile, a gesture that wasn't just polite, but encouraging. A few other staff members made subtle acknowledgments as Marcus walked by. Some were small, just a nod or a look, but they meant something. Support. It wasn't loud or flashy, but it was there, and for Marcus, it was enough. The morning rush began almost immediately. Marcus felt himself settle into the rhythm he had missed. He examined a teenage girl with a sprained wrist, assessed an elderly man with early signs of pneumonia, and gave a reassuring nod to a worried mother with a flu-stricken toddler. "Dr. Hayes," a voice called out, interrupting his focus. It was Emily, standing by the double doors leading to the ambulance bay. "Paramedics are bringing in a trauma case car accident on the expressway. ETA 3 minutes. Marcus nodded. "Prep trauma 1? I'll be there." The team moved quickly. Monitors beeped, gloves snapped, and supplies were prepared as they waited. When the paramedics wheeled the stretcher through the doors, Marcus was ready. The patient, a middle-aged woman, was unconscious. Blood matted her hair and stained her clothes. "Head trauma, possible internal bleeding," one of the paramedics reported. "TBP's low, 84/60. Marcus leaned over her as the team transferred her to the bed. "Ma'am, can you hear me? You're at the hospital. We're taking care of you." She didn't respond. "Let's get a head CT and full trauma labs," Marcus ordered, his voice steady. "Emily, keep pushing fluids to stabilize her pressure." The room was a storm of motion, but Marcus remained the calm center of it. Every instruction, every decision was made with the kind of quiet authority that made his team trust him without hesitation. This was where Marcus belonged, in the thick of it, saving lives. Hours later, the woman had been stabilized and transferred to surgery. Marcus stood by the nurse's station, rubbing his temples as he reviewed her notes. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a familiar exhaustion. "Dr. Hayes?" a soft voice called behind him. He turned to find a man in his 40s standing there, holding his hat nervously in his hands. "I'm Nathan Summers," the man said, his voice trembling. "The woman you just treated, she's my wife, Sarah." Marcus extended a hand, which Nathan shook firmly. "She's in good hands now, Mr. Summers. The surgeons are working on her injuries, but she's stable for the moment." Nathan's eyes filled with tears, and he blinked rapidly. I needed to say thank you. The paramedics told me how quickly you acted. If it weren't for you—" His voice broke, and he looked down. "You saved her life." Marcus's throat tightened. "I'm glad I could help." Nathan's gaze lifted to meet Marcus's, and his expression turned serious. "I heard about everything that's been happening. The news, the accusations." He paused, searching for the right words. "I don't know much about that, but I do know this. Anyone who saves lives the way you do doesn't deserve any of that." Marcus stared at him for a moment, caught off guard. Words like that unexpected kindness from strangers always hit harder than insults. "Thank you," Marcus said quietly, his voice genuine. Nathan smiled faintly and nodded before walking away. Marcus stood there for a moment, the weight of the last few weeks lifting just a little more. Later that afternoon, Marcus took a break in the empty staff lounge. He sat on the worn couch, sipping a bottle of water and letting his body rest. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small Gracias keychain from Luis's family, turning it over in his hands. It was strange how the smallest things carried the most meaning. The door opened, and Susan Harris stepped inside, holding a file. She looked at Marcus with a softer expression than usual. "I wanted to give you an update," she said, sitting down across from him. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "About what?" "The board reviewed everything: patient logs, statements, even your letter." She paused and smiled faintly. "They're satisfied. The case is closed." Marcus exhaled slowly, his shoulders finally relaxing. "That's good to hear." Susan nodded. "You should know something else, Marcus. The board also received letters from Luis Ramirez's family and several other patients you've treated over the years. Letters about the care you gave them, the lives you saved." Marcus looked up, surprised. "They wrote letters?" "They did," Susan confirmed. "And one of them ended with this: doctors like Marcus Hayes don't just treat patients, they save families." The words hit him harder than he expected, cutting through the noise of the last few weeks. He swallowed, nodding faintly. "Thank you for telling me that." Susan stood, placing the file on the table. "You're a good doctor, Marcus. The hospital knows it. Your patients know it. Don't let the rest of the world convince you otherwise." As she left, Marcus leaned back against the couch, staring at the ceiling. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he could breathe. When Marcus arrived home that evening, the house was filled with the smell of Michelle's cooking. Jordan was sitting at the dining table, scribbling something in his notebook. "Hey, Dad," Jordan called out. "You're home early." Marcus smiled faintly as he set his bag down. "Early for me, maybe." Michelle appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a kitchen towel. "Long day?" "A better day," Marcus replied, walking over and kissing her on the cheek. "A lot better." "Good," she said, studying his face. "You needed one of those." Marcus sat beside Jordan, ruffling his son's hair. "What's that you're working on?" Jordan grinned, holding up a paper. "It's a report for school. About someone I admire." Marcus's smile faltered as he stared at the page. At the top, written in neat letters, were the words, "My dad, the doctor." "You picked me?" Marcus asked, his voice quiet. "Of course," Jordan said matter-of-factly. "You save lives, Dad. That's pretty cool." Michelle watched the exchange, a small, proud smile on her face. Marcus looked at the report, then at his son's bright, honest eyes, and something inside him shifted. The world could say what it wanted, but here, in this house, the truth was clear. He wasn't just a doctor. He was someone his family admired, someone patients trusted, and someone who did the right thing, even when it cost him. For the first time in weeks, Marcus let himself believe that was enough. The snow had finally stopped falling. By morning, sunlight poured through the gray clouds, glinting off rooftops and glistening on the roads. It felt symbolic to Marcus, as though the world itself had exhaled after weeks of holding its breath. As he pulled into the hospital parking lot, he noticed how different it felt this time. No longer heavy or suffocating, just familiar. The hospital was where he belonged. Marcus stepped through the sliding glass doors of the ER, carrying the same steady calm he always did. The morning rush was in full swing. Paramedics wheeled in patients while nurses checked vitals, IV bags, and heart monitors beeped steadily in the background. Emily spotted him immediately. "Morning, Doc. Don't look now, but your fan club's growing." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Fan club?" She gestured toward the far end of the waiting room. A group of people, Luis Ramirez's family, a couple of former patients, and even Nathan Summers, whose wife Marcus had treated days before, stood clustered together, holding handwritten signs. One of the signs read, "Thank you, Dr. Hayes." Marcus stopped short, the sight catching him off guard. Luis's mother was there, holding her young daughter's hand. The little girl waved shyly when she saw Marcus. Emily grinned. "Looks like the word's getting out. Good doctors don't stay in the dark for long." Before Marcus could reply, Susan Harris appeared at his side. "We didn't expect this," she said softly, looking toward the group. Marcus took a breath, steadying himself before walking over to them. Luis's mother stepped forward, smiling warmly. "Dr. Hayes," she said, "we wanted to come and thank you in person. Luis is doing better every day, and it's because of you." "It wasn't just me," Marcus replied with quiet humility. "It was the entire team." "But you made the decision," she said. "You chose to save my son when it mattered most." Nathan Summers, the husband of the woman Marcus had stabilized, chimed in. "People need to hear stories like this. The truth, not the rumors." He gestured toward the signs. "We're here to make sure they do." Marcus looked around at the small group of people. They weren't loud or demanding attention. They were just there, a quiet show of support, gratitude written on their faces, handwritten in markers on their signs. The firestorm had made so much noise, but this was the truth. "Thank you," Marcus said softly, his voice almost catching. "It means more than I can say." As he turned back toward the ER, he felt lighter, as though the walls that had been pressing in on him were finally starting to crack open. The rest of the morning unfolded in the way Marcus loved best: busy, demanding, but purposeful. He moved through patient rooms with the efficiency and care his team had come to expect from him. An elderly man with pneumonia needed antibiotics. A young woman, pregnant and frightened, had come in with abdominal pain. Marcus examined her carefully, offering soft words of reassurance as he ordered tests to rule out anything serious. And then, toward mid-afternoon, an ambulance arrived carrying a man in his early 40s who had collapsed at work. Unresponsive on arrival, the paramedic reported as they wheeled him into Trauma 1. BP's dropping. No known history. Marcus leaned over the stretcher, scanning the man's pale face as the team worked quickly to stabilize him. "Get me a crash cart and page cardiology," Marcus ordered, his voice steady but urgent. The patient's pulse was faint, his breaths shallow. Marcus scanned the monitors, the erratic lines confirming his suspicion. Possible heart attack. As the team moved quickly around him, Marcus slipped into a familiar rhythm, giving orders, checking vitals, preparing for what might come next. But as he worked, he couldn't help but think about how easily this man's story might have ended differently if the ER team hadn't been prepared. For every patient like Luis Ramirez, whose life was saved, there was another who might not get a second chance. When the patient's pulse stabilized, Marcus stepped back, letting out a slow breath. "Let's get him upstairs to cardiology," he said, glancing at Emily, who stood ready to coordinate. Emily smiled faintly. "Still got it, Doc." Marcus offered a small smile in return. "Always." By evening, the ER had quieted. Marcus sat in the staff lounge with a cup of coffee, finally taking a moment to breathe. Emily walked in, holding her own cup and collapsing into the chair across from him. "You know," she said, stretching her legs out, I think the universe has a way of working things out. Marcus smirked. You getting philosophical on me, Emily? Maybe, she replied. But I'm serious. You've had a hell of a few weeks, but look where you are, right where you're supposed to be. Marcus nodded slowly, considering her words. It doesn't always feel that simple. Maybe not, Emily agreed. But that's what makes you good at this, Marcus. You don't take the easy way out. Even when it's hard, you keep showing up. Marcus looked down at his coffee cup, the warmth spreading through his hands. Sometimes it feels like that's all we can do, keep showing up. Exactly, Emily replied with a grin. It's not flashy, but it's enough. Her words stayed with him as he made his way through the hospital corridors, the quiet hum of the building settling into the night. On his way out, Marcus paused by the waiting room again, where a few of Luis's family members still sat talking quietly. Luis's little sister caught sight of him and smiled shyly. She ran over, holding something small in her hand. Dr. Hayes, she said, looking up at him with big, serious eyes. Hey there, Marcus replied, kneeling down to her level. She held out a crumpled piece of paper. I made you another drawing. Marcus unfolded it gently, his chest tightening at the sight. It was another simple picture stick figure of a doctor standing next to a smiling patient. Above it, in colorful, wobbly letters, it read, "Thank you for being a hero." Marcus swallowed hard, looking at the little girl. "Thank you. I'll keep this somewhere very special." She nodded solemnly and ran back to her mother, leaving Marcus standing there, holding the drawing in his hands. Hero. It was a word Marcus didn't often allow himself to hear. He thought of the struggles of the past weeks, the accusations, the doubts, the firestorm of anger, and realized that in the quiet moments, the truth had finally emerged. That night, at home, Marcus pinned the new drawing next to the first one on the small bulletin board in his office. The drawings sat side by side, simple but powerful, reminding him of the people who mattered most. Michelle leaned against the doorway, watching him quietly. Long day? A good day, Marcus replied, turning to her. She smiled, stepping forward and resting her head on his shoulder. You always said it was about the small victories, didn't you? Marcus nodded, his voice soft. Yeah, the small victories. Outside, the snow had melted just slightly, leaving damp sidewalks and the promise of spring in the air. The storm had passed not just in the skies, but within Marcus too. No matter how loud the world got, he would keep showing up, because that's what heroes did. The early morning sunlight stretched through the ER windows as Marcus stood by the nurse's station, reviewing charts. The hospital hummed with life-controlled chaos, moving with the rhythm only those in the emergency room truly understood. There was no judgment here, no room for bias or hesitation, only decisions that meant the difference between life and death. The past weeks had been a storm, but Marcus had come through it changed, perhaps, but steady. The doubts, the noise, and the accusations had faded into the background, though Marcus knew they would never completely disappear. They were part of a larger, broken world that he couldn't fix. But here, in the ER, his role was clear: save lives, one decision at a time. Emily strode past him, sharp and focused as always. You're looking unusually serene this morning, Doc, she teased, waving a chart in the air. Too much coffee, or are we all dreaming? Neither, Marcus replied, his mouth curling into a faint smile. Just appreciating the quiet before it gets crazy. Enjoy it while it lasts, Emily quipped. It's flu season. Peace is a short-term rental around here. Marcus chuckled, shaking his head as he grabbed the next chart. She was right. Peace in the ER was borrowed time. By mid-morning, the hospital was a hive of activity. Marcus moved from room to room, tending to patients. An elderly man with chest pain, a toddler with a fever, a teenage girl who'd fallen on an icy sidewalk, her ankle bruised and swollen. Marcus's steady presence reassured them all, his calm voice making sense of their fear. "Dr. Hayes?" a nurse called as he stepped into the hallway. "There's a family here asking for you specifically." Marcus's brow furrowed. "Do they have a patient?" They said no. "Just wanted to talk to you." Curious, Marcus walked to the waiting room. Sitting there was Luis Ramirez, the young man Marcus had saved weeks ago. Luis sat in a wheelchair, his mother and sister at his side. He looked healthier now, though still thin, his face a little pale. When they saw Marcus, their faces lit up. "Dr. Hayes," Luis's mother said, standing. "We didn't mean to interrupt your work, but Luis insisted we come." Marcus stepped forward, offering Luis a warm smile. "It's good to see you up and about. How are you feeling?" Luis grinned faintly. "Alive, thanks to you." Marcus knelt beside the wheelchair, meeting Luis at eye level. "You were strong enough to fight through it. That's what matters." Luis hesitated, looking down at his hands. I heard what happened," he said quietly. "About the people who said you did something wrong. I've been thinking about it a lot." Marcus tilted his head, his voice gentle. "You don't need to worry about that, Luis." Luis shook his head. "No, I do. Because I'm here because of the decision you made, and people need to know that." Luis's mother nodded in agreement, tears glistening in her eyes. "Luis is alive because you didn't hesitate, Dr. Hayes. That's the truth. We wanted to come and say it in person." Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest, not from anger or sadness this time, but from something quieter, softer. "Gratitude. Thank you," he said softly, his voice nearly catching. Luis reached out and shook Marcus's hand firmly, his grip stronger than Marcus expected. "Thank you for saving me." For a moment, Marcus couldn't speak. He simply nodded, letting the weight of the moment settle. This was why he kept showing up, why he pushed through the storms that came his way. The day pressed on, the work relentless but familiar. Marcus treated an elderly woman who had slipped on ice and a man whose flu had turned into pneumonia. Decisions were made, lives were helped. The rhythm of the ER pulled him forward like a current. Toward evening, Marcus sat at the nurse's station, updating his notes. Emily plopped into the chair beside him, letting out an exaggerated sigh. "We survived another day, Docky. Barely." Marcus smiled faintly. "You're getting dramatic in your old age." She shot him a look. "Careful, I'm not that far behind you." They sat quietly for a moment, the hum of the hospital filling the space between them. Then Emily glanced at him, her expression softening. "You know, Marcus, you made it through a firestorm most people wouldn't have survived, and here you are, still standing." "I'm not sure I had much choice," Marcus replied. "No," Emily said, shaking her head. "You did have a choice. You could have caved. You could have apologized to people who didn't deserve it just to make this easier. But you didn't." Marcus met her gaze. "Because that's not who I am." Emily smiled. "Exactly. And we need people like you, steady, strong, willing to do what's right no matter how loud the world gets." Marcus looked down at his hands, her words settling over him like a blanket. "It's not always easy." "The right thing never is," she replied. That night, Marcus walked through the door of his house and was greeted by the smell of something warm and familiar. Michelle was in the kitchen, humming to herself as she stirred a pot on the stove. Jordan sat at the dining table, scribbling in his notebook. "Hey, Dad," Jordan said, looking up with a bright smile. "Hey, kiddo." Marcus hung up his coat and stepped into the kitchen, pausing to kiss Michelle on the cheek. "That smells amazing." "Chicken soup," she replied, smiling. "I figured you needed a little comfort food tonight." Marcus sat at the table, watching Jordan work on something intently. "What are you writing?" Jordan grinned and held up the paper. "It's the final copy of my report. My dad, the doctor." Marcus took the paper, his throat tightening as he read the first line. My dad is the kind of doctor who saves lives, even when it's hard. He doesn't just help people, he makes them feel safe. Marcus looked at Jordan, his voice soft. Thank you. Jordan shrugged, a small smile on his face. It's just the truth, Dad. Michelle sat beside him, her hand resting on his. You did it, Marcus. You made it through. Marcus exhaled, his chest feeling lighter than it had in weeks. Yeah, I did. Outside, the snow had melted, leaving damp streets and the faint promise of spring. The storm was gone, but the line Marcus had walked, the line that saves lives, remained. It wasn't always easy, and it wasn't always fair, but it was worth it. And he would keep showing up, no matter how loud the world got. Because sometimes, quiet strength was the loudest truth of all. Marcus Hayes' story is not just about saving lives in the emergency room. It's about resilience, integrity, and quiet strength. He stood tall in the face of accusations and doubt, not because it was easy, but because it was right. For every storm, Marcus found moments of gratitude, small acts of kindness, a word of thanks, or a child's drawing that reminded him of his purpose. In life, we are all faced with moments where doing what's right feels like the hardest choice. But as Marcus shows us, it's those choices, no matter how challenging, that define who we are. If you found this story inspiring, don't forget to hit that like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, grounded, heartfelt, and filled with hope. Thank you for watching. And remember, quiet strength, kindness, and integrity will always shine through the darkest storms. See you in the next story.